Welcome to the OMG Tarot podcast. I'm your host, Lindsay, aka OMG Tarot. Following up last week's discussion of the Fool, this week we're going to be taking a look at the Wheel of Fortune. I chose the Wheel of Fortune to go next because at number 10 in the Major Arcana, it has a relationship with the Magician and the Sun. And since we just talked about the Sun and alluded a bit to this relationship with both the Magician and the Wheel of Fortune, I wanted to expand on that and answer any lingering questions that you might have from the Sun episode. Here's what I mean by their relationship. Remember how a few times on this podcast we've talked about cards that when you reduce a larger card's number, you get a smaller card's number? For example, the Devil is number 15, and when you add 1 plus 5, you get 6, which is the Lovers, and there is some crossover thematically between the Devil and the Lovers. With the Sun, we've got something similar going on. The Sun is number 19, and when you add its two numbers together, you get 1 plus 9 equals 10, which is the Wheel of Fortune, or you can add 1 plus 0 of that 10 to reduce it down even further, which brings us to the Magician. So what do these three cards have in common? They all speak to themes of progress and destiny and moving along toward a more in-touch, in-tune version of yourself. The Magician starts by getting acquainted with his tools. After the Fool sets off on his journey, he encounters the four elements that he's going to be working with as he progresses through that journey. We see this on the table in front of the Magician, where we have a sword, a pentacle, a wand, and a cup. The Magician's tools make progress on this journey literally possible. And with these tools in hand, our main character progresses through the next few lessons of the Major Arcana, going through the Empress, the Emperor, the Hierophant. I won't list them all up here. But then by the time we get to number 10, the Wheel of Fortune, it's apparent what direction our Fool is going to progress in. They say the Wheel of Fortune is associated with luck, but it's important to note here that this isn't the kind of luck like winning a scratch-off or winning at a slot machine. It's more like opportunities. If you're into astrology, it's more like what the planet Jupiter symbolizes. Think of it more like you create your own luck by putting in the work. You progress by making an effort and making strides, and you really pave the path for yourself and for opportunities to enter your world. I suppose the connection to luck could also be this card's association with randomness, how sometimes luck isn't always great. You could have bad luck. And random circumstances, both positive and negative, can intersect with this idea of you create your own luck and you usher in the opportunities that present themselves to you. So for example, you might be an aspiring novelist and you write every single day and you get critiques from other writers and you really work hard on your craft. However, you know it's very difficult to get a novel published, especially as a first-time author. But you keep at it, you work, you write, you revise, you edit, and then, just by lucky happenstance, your best friend starts dating a literary agent. This doesn't mean they're under any obligation to represent your work or to work with you, but the fact that this person has now entered your social circle can feel like a Wheel of Fortune moment because now here's an opportunity. Connect with them, and if not them, maybe they can point you toward one of your colleagues. You still are ultimately in charge of what happens, and if your book's not good, well, it's not going to get picked up regardless, but now you've got this opportunity that's presented itself to you, and it's intersecting with the luck and the destiny that you've been building for yourself all the way. Then, later on in the deck, we reach the Sun, and as we talked about last week, the Sun is all about being uninhibited and being free and expressing yourself to your full potential. You built on those opportunities and you harnessed luck to your advantage. And just as importantly, when bad luck showed up, you navigated it, you rolled with it. And along the line, you might have pivoted. And now you know yourself better. You've learned about yourself through the course of these scenarios, and you're a more well-rounded, fleshed-out individual who's able to be freer and more authentic. Today we're going to drill down more on that middle card, the Wheel of Fortune, and really examine what its symbols say about this idea of luck and progress, and even some ideas about karma and the destiny you create for yourself. This card is one of the most esoteric cards in the deck, and now what I mean by that is that, unlike certain other cards, like, to give an example, the Fool, the Wheel of Fortune relies on a lot of understanding of alchemical symbolism and a knowledge of astrology to fully get what's going on in this card. Because the Fool, you don't have to be a tarot card reader to tell me what's going on in that card. It certainly helps to understand the symbolism there, but anybody can take a look at that image and at least take an educated stab at what it means. We see a young person and their dog who look like they're about to leap off a cliff, and they don't look worried about it. I think even if you have zero tarot experience, you can at least understand, hey, someone is making a big undertaking here, and perhaps they're not fully aware of what that undertaking is going to entail for them. But you look at the Wheel of Fortune, and it's a wheel. And it's got a couple of characters that are sitting on it and hanging out next to it. And who's that red devil guy who's kind of almost looks, this always reminded me of if you ever look at a pirate ship or an old-timey ship like that, like the wooden carved maiden figurine that's right on the bow looking over the ocean. That's what this devil's positioning looks like to me. And the four characters in the corners are all reading books. This card feels like it would make a great poster for a library. So let's break it down symbol by symbol and uncover what these esoteric symbols mean. But before I do that, perhaps it's worthwhile to define the word esoteric, because if you've been in the tarot world, you've undoubtedly come across it, but you might not know what it means, so here's what it means. It means likely to be understood only by a small niche group of people that have specialized knowledge. Tarot is esoteric, but this particular tarot card is more esoteric than the rest because of the reasons I just said. How you can look at a card like the Fool and make a pretty good guess about what's going on. Let's start with the four figures in the four corners of this card. These four figures symbolize the four fixed signs: Aquarius, Scorpio, Taurus, and Leo. In our episode about the Death card, we talked a bit about the different forms of Scorpio and how it's a scorpion, but it isn't just a scorpion. We have the phoenix and we have the serpent. In the upper right-hand corner of this card, you see the phoenix version of Scorpio. You might not have caught that if you didn't know your more deep-cut astrology, hence esoteric. Moving over to the upper left-hand corner, that's Aquarius, which again, where are her decanters? Aquarius's claim to fame is being the water bearer, and she does not have decanters full of water to pour it out. I wish I had an answer for you here, but I don't. Just trust that this angel is depicting Aquarius, and it kind of reminds me, honestly, she looks more like Temperance than the star to me. But anyway, the point is that these are the four fixed signs, which means that they're the signs that occur during the midpoint of a season, and they're the ones that hold the energy and see it through to its logical conclusion. They're fixed, they're rigid, they're not the starters or the finishers, they are the maintainers. You can read this as, while that wheel in the middle keeps spinning and keeps symbolizing changing luck and changing circumstances, self-mastery and study and self-awareness will keep you grounded. It'll keep you stable. As you can see, these four fixed signs are all reading, and they're all looking pretty intently at the books. They're pretty engrossed because they're pretty committed to reading and learning and understanding. These four symbols are also the symbols of the four evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, from the Christian Bible. Did Pamela Coleman Smith choose to include these four symbols as a direct allusion to the four evangelists? Possibly. Is it a bit convenient that the symbols for the four evangelists line up kind of nicely with the four fixed signs? Honestly, I think so, and I can't help but wonder if perhaps the Aquarius angel connection here is a little bit shoehorned in. Of course, tarot is subjective, and as you develop as a reader, you'll develop your own connections and interpretations of the cards. But I think it's worth looking at previous editions of the Wheel of Fortune and determining perhaps when and where did these four symbols get worked into the artwork on the Wheel of Fortune, and should we be reading them more so as zodiac references or religious allusions, or possibly both? In Marseille style decks, there aren't four figures in the corners. There's just the wheel with a few animals on it who almost look like they're riding it like a Ferris wheel. These decks also have an authoritative figure sitting on top of the wheel, but it's not a sphinx. We'll circle back, to the sphinx in a bit. In the Thoth deck, we do have a sphinx sitting at the top, and we have a couple of animals that are, again, on the wheel itself, but this time they look like they're part of the wheel. The wheel just, they almost look more like they're ornaments on the wheel rather than separate figures who are riding the wheel. Looking back at the Visconti Sforza Tarot, we again see figures on the wheel, but not in the corners. So from this we can deduce that the four figures in the corners of this card are a fairly modern invention. But that still doesn't answer our question of, are these references to the four fixed zodiac signs, or are they references to the four evangelists, or are they references to both? Personally, I think it's more likely that they symbolize the four fixed signs, because we know Pamela Coleman Smith incorporated quite a lot of astrology into the illustration she did for this deck. And, admittedly, I'm not a biblical scholar, so I had to look this up. When I read about the reason why the four evangelists are symbolized with the symbols that they are, that didn't really feel like it lined up with the meaning of this tarot card. So just a real quick, because I know it's a bit of a tangent, but I also think it's relevant from a history and religious and sociology perspective, and if it resonates with you, it might be something worth working into your practice. Matthew is symbolized by the angel because this symbolizes Christ's human nature. Mark is symbolized specifically by a winged lion, not just a regular lion, as a way to symbolize courage and rulership. Luke is symbolized by the winged ox to symbolize service and strength, and John is symbolized by the eagle, which symbolizes flying higher into the sky and soaring into the heavens. So I think in the context of this tarot card, which is still largely about how circumstances can be fortunate or unfortunate, and this idea of how are you going to roll with the punches that life throws your way, symbolizing these four aspects of Christ through the four evangelists just doesn't really resonate with me. It feels like they're kind of two different traditions that you might sort of try to stick together because there's some overlap, but I'm saying they're separate. But see what I mean about this card is pretty esoteric? It's also one that I've personally found to be a bit more challenging to interpret than a lot of other cards because it's so esoteric. So next let's take a look at that devil who's on the bottom right-hand side of the wheel and is looking over at the viewer. And it almost kind of looks like the wheel is wedged between his butt cheeks? Yeah. This is actually a reference to Anubis, an Egyptian god. Anubis was a jackal-headed god who guided people through the afterlife and was largely concerned with reincarnation. Now, Anubis on this card links to the symbolism of the Sphinx, who's sitting up top, as well as that snake that's over on the left-hand side. And this isn't the first time we've seen ancient Egyptian imagery used in our tarot deck. Again, I'm referencing the Rider-Waite-Smith deck here, so your mileage may vary. So to understand how these three fit together, you also need to visualize this wheel turning forward and turning backward, because it largely has to do with where each of them end up on the wheel. Let's start with Anubis. Anubis on this card symbolizes the positive aspects of reincarnation, because in ancient Egyptian tradition, a person would die, go to the underworld, and then be reincarnated into their soul's next life. Anubis played a role in this. So this is kind of playing on similar themes to what we saw in the death card of death is just setting you up for the next phase and the rebirth. And taken more figuratively, this could speak to how as life throws circumstances your way, it's going to end some things, but like that old platitude of when one door closes, another opens, Anubis is here to remind you that things transform and things open up to new experiences and new possibilities, and don't take every ending as an absolute ending. Then, going counterclockwise, we have the Sphinx, who is up at the top. This is another symbol that we've talked about a bit, specifically in the Chariot episode, about how the Sphinx is symbolic of the combining of the spiritual realm with the human realm, because it's got a human face and a human upper torso, but the rest of it is a lion, and as well as that black and white head covering it's wearing, this one is all about combining different forces and combining, say, the human and the animal, or the earthly and the divine. And in doing this, the Sphinx symbolizes knowledge, because take a look at what that Sphinx is grasping. Pamela Coleman Smith was pretty deliberate in this. This is a sword, and in tarot, swords are knowledge and understanding. So now let's move on to the snake that's over there on the left-hand side. That's a reference to another Egyptian god, Typhon. Typhon is the god of storms, and by extension, is the one in control of a lot of destructive things like fires and hurricanes and volcanoes. We can also read this as similar energy to the Tower card, which I know we haven't gotten to yet, but just a heads up, when we get to the Tower, we're going to expand on this idea a whole lot more. So, putting them all together, as this wheel turns, different things get highlighted and they stay present. However, you might be at a turn of the wheel where Anubis and the reincarnation is on the upswing, or you might be at another turn of the wheel where, oh, the snake is now the one who's turning upward, and yeah, we're facing a challenging era. We're going through some difficult circumstances here. But all the while, the Sphinx is still holding on to the wheel and still carrying that knowledge through every single thing that this wheel rolls on through. Which just brings me to another thought about the blending of traditions in the illustrations that Pamela Coleman Smith chose to include in this deck. Why are we reading allusions to ancient Egyptian theology more literally than we might read an allusion to Christian theology from the four symbols of the evangelists in the corner? I think if I was somebody in 1909 picking up a first edition of this deck, I'd likely be more inclined to recognize the four symbols in the corners before recognizing the symbolism of the three figures who are around the wheel. For me personally, my interpretation that tends to lean more on the zodiac symbols versus the evangelists is also partly informed by knowing a bit about how Pamela Coleman Smith designed this deck and why she made some of the choices she made. But we also have evidence that she included quite a number of biblical allusions in here, so how concrete and how well grounded is my interpretation? And I think all of this is a discussion worth having, because how you interpret the cards is ultimately up to you. And I think the more grounded you are in why you interpret them a certain way, the better you're going to be at interpreting them. And I realize we're also now kind of getting into the territory of, are we close reading these tarot cards? Is death of the author relevant here? The author in this case being Pamela Coleman Smith. And this is the OMG Tarot podcast, not the OMG Literary Analysis podcast, so I think we're going to cut that discussion there, but I really just think that's a very valuable piece of food for thought to chew on a bit as you come away from this episode and think hard about the Wheel of Fortune. Pulling in another religious tradition to this card, we have the text around the wheel. We've got the Hebrew Tetragrammaton, which is the unutterable name of God. My interpretation of this is that the divine is here and present with us through everything we experience as we move through life and as this wheel turns. And if you'll notice, these Hebrew letters are interspersed with four Latin letters, T, A, R, and O. And these can be arranged depending on how you want to read them, be it clockwise or counterclockwise, and how this wheel turns to spell a few different things. It could phonetically spell Torah, much like we see on the High Priestess. She also has Torah spelled this way without the H. It could also phonetically spell tarot. It can also spell rota, which is the Latin word for wheel. It's also the Italian word for wheel, as I learned this summer. So, all in all, there's a lot going on in this card, and it all relates back to this idea of things are going to happen randomly, things are going to happen by chance, and sometimes you can take those situations and turn them into opportunities for growth. Other times, the growth happens through perhaps avoiding the worst aspects of them or knowing how to dodge or roll with the situations that life throws your way. I'm going to leave you with one last piece of symbolism from this card, and that is that it's happening up in the sky. Take note of how it's against a sky blue background with clouds. This is not grounded, this is up in the air. And so I think it's worth thinking about this in context of the element of air. There's a lot to do with truth and knowledge here. And I think this card is also, through that symbolism, communicating that this is true. This is reality. Reality is that you control yourself. You don't always control your environment. And so it's a valuable skill set to be able to recognize when something is beyond your control, when it's within your control, and how to navigate that intelligently. There's also, one last thing, and then we'll get into interpreting this card. The symbols on the inner portion of the wheel are the alchemical symbols for mercury, sulfur, water, and salt. And these were widely considered to be the 4 elements involved in all creation. So you can even think of this as a bit of a callback to the 4 elements present on the magician's table in The Magician. Alright, so that might have been the longest analysis I have ever done of a tarot card. Let's take a look at what the Wheel of Fortune means when it comes up in a reading. When the Wheel of Fortune comes up in a reading, it's a reminder that life is random, stuff happens. You're not always in total control of your environment, and in order to navigate it, you've got to, for one, be aware of that, and for two, find a way to adeptly move yourself through it. Remember, it's a major arcana card, so it's speaking more about the broad, overarching situation you find yourself in, rather than the day-to-day. Let's say you pull the Wheel of Fortune and the Two of Swords together. In the day-to-day, the practical part of what you're up to, the Two of Swords is telling you to trust your gut and trust your instincts, and basically, don't overthink it. Let logic lead the way, because that's the card that's got the seated woman with the blindfold on, and she's got the 2 swords in front of her, and all that calm water really far back behind her, so she's not letting her emotions rule the situation. She's just letting those swords of knowledge be what guides her through. But this, right up with the Wheel of Fortune, we can combine their meaning to say, as you navigate a random world and situations that may present themselves as opportunities, but they could also be opportunities for downfall, trust your gut. Don't overthink it, don't overfeel it. Just trust what you know somewhere deep inside of you to be in your best interest, and usually what's the most logical is going to be what's the most right. Or let's say, for example, you pull the 10 of Cups with the Wheel of Fortune. One thing that comes up frequently in the tarot classes I teach is this idea of a good card versus a bad card, and I always remind my students that no card is inherently good or bad. They're all more so situations or people or scenarios that, as you fit them into the greater tableau of your life and what you're doing, could be good, could be bad. But also, let's be honest with ourselves. The 10 of Cups, how can that be bad? It's a nice, happy family. They're dancing. They've got a rainbow. Everything is pretty. Everything is lovely. Everyone's got what they need. How on earth are you going to tell me, oh, this card could have a negative reading? Well, because, as I said, they're all story points and they all fit into the story. So let's say we read the Wheel of Fortune with the Ten of Cups. Maybe this is saying that right now you're in a good spot emotionally and everyone's got what they need, but randomness happens, and as that wheel turns, perhaps other things will gurgle up to the surface and disrupt this happy and harmony. Maybe this is talking about a scenario like you and your family are all assembled for Thanksgiving and you're all having fun, you're passing around the mashed potatoes, and everything is very surface level, cordial, and friendly, but you've got some choice words to say to a cousin of yours and some thoughts about some previous behavior that maybe if they say or do or something triggers during this Thanksgiving dinner, all of a sudden the joy and harmony just goes right out the window. And maybe this is an opportunity to finally speak your truth and to call your cousin out. Or maybe it's an opportunity for you to completely make a fool of yourself and be embarrassed. It's pretty apt that the Sphinx on the top of the Wheel of Fortune has a sword in its paws because you're going to have to use knowledge to know how do I navigate this opportunity and how do I accurately gauge is this an opportunity to speak my mind and can I realistically expect it to go well for me? I still don't think that makes the Ten of Cups a bad card in this context, but do you see how it's just a completely neutral story point? It's a story point of everybody's happy, everybody's having a good time, everybody is emotionally very stable right now. Maybe you pull the Ten of Cups with the Tower and, this stability might not last for much longer and is in need of a checking and a reckoning. We'll talk more about situations like that in the episode about the Tower. And speaking of Thanksgiving, heads up, it's a Thursday, the same day of the week this podcast drops, and that is the only scheduled Thursday off that I have planned for the rest of this calendar year. So I know it's a couple weeks out at this point, but there will not be a new episode on Thanksgiving Thursday. However, I've got my calendar made up, and there will be a new episode, barring any kind of situation or extenuating circumstance, every Thursday for the remainder of 2024. But yeah, that about wraps up our discussion of the Wheel of Fortune. So I hope you learned something, and I really implore you to take a closer look at this card and really focus on how am I interpreting all the symbols here, because this one can be a bit of a toughie, and I think that's a good mindset to bring to all the tarot cards you read. And really just ask yourself, what do I think this symbol is communicating? Because every deck comes with a little white book, and those little white books can be very helpful, but they can also become a crutch. I think they're a great way to double check what you're interpreting and also to get an idea of what the artist intended when they were designing a deck, but they shouldn't overrule you and your interpretations as a reader. So, and it's okay to be not sure of what you think an image means. It's okay to look it up, but I think before you go looking it up, I think it's absolutely just worth your while to come up with, all right, what do I think it means? What's my best stab at it? Let me at least kind of determine what I think it maybe means before I go seeking an official definition. As always, if you want to chat tarot with me, please do. You can reach out to me via email at omg@omgtarot.com or on Instagram, where my handle is its_omg_tarot. I'm also doing a special episode for Halloween, which is also a Thursday this year. So if you are a tarot card reader, I want to hear your reader horror stories. Tell me about horror stories of situations when you've been perhaps reading for yourself or reading for clients. The spooky, the terrifying, the bewildering, and the silly. If you've got a horror story that's a little more Nightmare Before Christmas than The Shining, hey, I want to hear it. Just DM me for more information or head over to omgtarot.com and click on Reader Horror Stories up there in the header. I'd love to share your horror story here on the Halloween edition of the podcast, and of course, Your name and any other names in it will be anonymized for everyone's privacy. I'm not about calling people out or anything like that. So, yeah, reach out if you yourself are a reader and you've got a horror story to share, or just reach out if you want to talk about tarot. That's about it for me, so I hope you learned a lot, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. We'll talk soon. Bye bye.